Hello and welcome again to The Last Nighters. We are The Last Nighters, Robert and Daniel. My name is Daniel, and we are going to talk about the Disney Pixar film from 2006 called Cars, because we like to do kids' movies on here, apparently, because, well, you know, there's a lot of messaging going on in these movies, and kids haven't quite learned enough to really tell the propaganda from the real stuff. Things like that, right? Right, Robert?
Yeah, it's easily hidden and snuck in, especially in Disney movies. And, you know, if you got a young toddler or what have you, they're probably super into these kinds of cartoons and princesses, and they'll watch these movies on repeat. And it's good to know what you're programming your kids with.
Yeah,
so
programming is right. That's for sure.
Yeah, I think I would avoid Disney movies, at least most of them. But if nothing else, at least be aware of what your kids are being exposed to.
All right, well said, and we'll be getting into some of these issues as we analyze this film on this episode of The Last Nighters, which can be found at lastnighters.com/9, and we generally start out with a Google description. So here we go. Cars, 2006 sports adventure movie, an hour and 57 minutes, 7.1 on the IMDb, 74% Rotten Tomatoes, and 86% of Google users like it. And the description reads, while traveling to California to race against the King, played by Richard Petty, and Chick Hicks, Michael Keaton, for the Piston Cup Championship, Lightning McQueen, played by Owen Wilson, becomes lost after falling out of his trailer in a run-down town called Radiator Springs. While there, he slowly befriends the town's odd residents, including Sally, Doc Hudson, and Mater, and when it comes time for him to leave to championship, is no longer his top priority. That is really awkwardly worded. When it comes time for him to leave to championship, is no longer his top priority. Came out March 14th, 2006. Director John Lasseter did very well at the box office, $462.2 million. Also, the final performance by Paul Newman, and Bonnie Hunt plays Sally, and Larry the Cable Guy is Mater. So other than the really awkwardly worded last sentence of the description, do you have any issues with it?
Well, it's interesting that they tell almost the entire story right there. There's not leaving you any kind of surprises left, other than maybe the finale of how it ends. But I prefer to think of this movie, you know, alternatively. There is I don't know if you're familiar with this, Daniel, but there's I don't know how popular it is, but there is a theory that all these Cars, planes movies take place in a post-apocalyptic world. And I like to think of it as a movie that takes place post, like, Maximum Overdrive, where all the cars have brutally murdered all the humans.
What? Quite the kids' movie here.
That's right. So this place technically takes place in the Stephen King-averse. And, yeah, if you look at it that way, it's a much darker, more grim movie. Of course, you can look at it any way you want, but I like to think of it as just a weird choice for Disney. Let's make a movie where all the humans have been brutally murdered by the vehicles, and then we'll make a fun, bubbly kids movie about it. All right.
Yeah, I didn't get that vibe. I got the, you know, what if cars were essentially the humans in this world? But I did notice that this is basically a remake of an 80s classic, or maybe mid-90s classic, starring Michael J. Fox, called Doc Hollywood. It's essentially the same story in regards to the Sally Carrera Porsche leaving the L.A. and moving to the rundown, podunk town. That's what Michael J. Fox does. He's a doctor from L.A. and ends up in some small town, and through the course of the movie, comes to appreciate the smallness, and he ends up staying there. So, if you don't want to see Cars, watch Doc Hollywood. Basically the same thing. Yeah,
or almost every Bill Murray movie. where the main character is a jerk at the beginning, learns to be a nice guy, and everybody likes him at the end.
Yeah, because that is pretty much what happens here. Owen Wilson plays Lightning McQueen, and he's this brash rookie who's got a lot of talent, but he's also a showboat and really hard to work with and keeps firing people and kind of taking all the credit and not being such a nice guy. And he gets humbled a little bit, I guess, throughout this whole ordeal, and comes to appreciate the value of a team, right? I guess that's the kid lesson in this, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I mean, there's some serious telegraphing going on in the first, 5-10 minutes where McQueen is like kind of this jerk guy, and he kind of snubs his team as he's going around in this race. And of course, this little pit crew, they all quit. So there's going to be, it's kind of like a redemption story coming up through the rest of the movie. And then a series of improbable events occurs that really, watching it, I was just like, really? 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 But because, it just happens one after the other, this series of improbable events to get him into this little podunk town. But, I mean, I'm not going to really nitpick some kid's movie for being so ridiculous. I mean, we're talking about a movie with, talking cars in it, so.
Yeah, fair enough. That's for sure. And I just wanted to point out that one of the impeti for this movie was a documentary that the director saw, and then he went on a cross-country road trip with his family. And it was called Divided Highways. It's a 1997 PBS documentary, and it was highlighting the story of the interstate highway system and how it came to be. And there's a whole host of issues with that we could certainly get into, or perhaps on a Boys Night Out version of our show where we have guests and talk about other issues related to the movies or anything else that comes up. But the idea in Divided Highways that was brought up was that when the interstates went in, a lot of the older roads that ran through the towns got passed by. And so a lot of the towns would basically die as a result because the highway would bypass them, and then the car traffic traveling much faster speeds and not needing to stop as often, etc., would no longer need to go into these towns for services. And so then the towns would die off. And so that was sort of the idea behind Radiator Springs being on Route 66, and then Highway 40 comes along, and no one has any reason to go into Radiator Springs any longer.
Indeed. And that was one thing that I had trouble with, like feeling any kind of sympathy for these people. I mean, we can get into your documentary. I didn't see your documentary. But in my mind, you live by the road, you die by the road. Your entire business model is set up for this traffic. And then a better road comes along and diverts that traffic. I'm sorry, unless you can have a way to pull in traffic, get out of there. Move. I mean, at one point, the Giuseppe, Italian little dude, like Lightning McQueen, buys some tires from him, and he's like, holy smokes, this is like my first sale in years. How are you staying in business if you're not some mafia front? How is any of this place in business? It reminded me of, have you seen that documentary, or at least YouTube clip or whatever, about, it's like there's this town, I forget what it's called. It's like Stone Town or something. That's wrong, but it's about this town in like Southern California, out in the desert, which is essentially kind of like this anarchist place. It's like Freedom Town or something like that. But it's just out in the middle of nowhere. And nobody lives there except, basically a bunch of hippies living off, like, pension checks or welfare or something like that. But it's just like, there's no reason for these people to be here. Especially if these are cars that, want to have businesses and provide services to people, which is great. I'm all about that. These are entrepreneurs. But, can't they see the writing on the wall?
Yeah, apparently not. And that's the other side of the equation that a lot of people don't generally understand, is that it's a profit and loss system. And you're taking entrepreneurial risk when you're running a business and trying to provide services, goods and services to fickle customers, fickle consumers. And it's those who don't satisfy the needs and wants of consumers that end up making losses and eventually going out of business. And to your point regarding Giuseppe not having sales in years, he was clearly making losses this entire time, unless he had a big nest egg that he was living off of, or he was a mafioso front, as you suggest. He was not participating in profits, certainly.
Yeah, part of being an entrepreneur, being a business owner, is evaluating risk and, looking for opportunity and being aware of the competitive environment and, realizing that you just got outcompeted by this other road. So either you got to pack up and move or go out of business or, have the improbable series of events that leads to this movie happening, which through very little work of their own, they then get revitalized at the end of the movie, spoilers, but only because of this just ridiculous series of events where Lightning McQueen pushes his truck to go, while he's falling asleep and not take a break for really no reason other than he wanted to get practice on a circle. I really got to get to this new track out west for this race because I got to practice because I've never driven on a circle before.
Yeah, you just turn left a bunch. Just turn left, which Owen was in Zoolander with Ben Stiller, and the joke in that was that he couldn't turn left, the Ben Stiller character, and of course that's all Owen Wilson does in this one.
Right. And then he gets off the highway because he thinks, his truck is going off in the highway. So he follows the highway. Or he follows the truck, which he thinks is his truck. And it turns out to not be his truck. But then another series of events happens, and he's getting chased by this cop who just so happens to be backfiring, so he can't stop because he thinks he's getting shot at. Anyway, then...
That part stood out to me, and I thought that would be an interesting point to discuss, but continue.
We could talk about that, but... So then he gets, lost, and he can't find his way back to the highway. And I just want to say, there's one road. He's on Route 66, and it intersects with this highway. There's one road. You cannot get lost. But there's a big chunk of this movie where Owen Wilson is like, I don't know how to get back to the highway. And there's some tourists that come into town, and everybody gets psyched about it, and they ask Owen Wilson for directions back to the highway, and he's like, I have no idea. How are you a car, and I understand he's a race car, whatever, how are you a car that drives on roads, and there's one road going to one place, and he's like, I'm lost, I have no idea. But whatever, you got to have a movie, I guess.
Yeah, I kind of gave him the benefit of the doubt on that one because he's a race car, right? He's used to getting taken around places in the back of that John Ratzenberger truck.
Yeah, right. So you can give him the benefit of the doubt there, but I still thought it was quite ridiculous. But yeah, he is kind of like this big city guy that gets ferried around and treated like whatever. But still, it turns him into a complete idiot if he can't follow one road.
Yeah, that's true. But I think that's and we get back to the cop thing in a minute. But when we have two kids, and we're trying to not do everything for them because we don't want them to not learn how to do stuff and not experience things. And if somebody enables them and does everything for them and they never have to experience how to do it, then they'll never figure it out, right? So I feel like that's what happened with the Owen Wilson character in this. And by the way, they call him Lightning the Queen because they think that he's a queen, and that the Richard Petty character, they call him the King. They call him King with the dinos on him because they think it's something to do with royalty and princesses and whatnot. But I try to tell him he is Lightning McQueen. It's his name. It's not that he is a queen. But anyway. Sharing the stories of the kids.
I'm not going to make any judgments about the intelligence of your kids. That's fine. What did you want to talk about with the cop?
So the cop thing was interesting because a lot of people don't see it this way, but I think you and I would agree that as soon as they flick on the lights to have you pull over, they are threatening you. That if you don't pull over, they're going to escalate the situation and up to and including shooting you. And him backfiring, Lightning McQueen thought that was happening to him. And I think he had every reason to try to get away, you know?
I completely agree. In fact, there's a point where once he starts hearing backfiring, he starts driving erratically. And he says to himself, serpentine, serpentine, because that's the way you're supposed to move when you're being shot at. So he's acting completely rationally. But, of course, the cop thinks he's a crazy person. Got to get him.
Yeah, he's drunk or something, right?
Yeah, I thought that was all entirely accurate with reality. That was probably the most realistic scene in the movie. Except that the cop didn't end up murdering McQueen.
Right, just enslaving him.
Right, just enslaving him, correct.
Yeah, throwing him in a cage. And then they have this kangaroo court thing, which I don't know how the court proceedings typically work, but the judge, Doc Hudson, let him go, and then Carrera is like, no. But wasn't the decision already, announced? So, didn't they kind of go back on the whole due process thing there?
Well, I just like how there's a total of 10 people in this town, and 3 of them are bureaucratic, government people. One's the cop, one's the judge, and one's the lawyer. And then there's Mater, who I guess also kind of counts because he runs the impound lot.
He's like the bailiff.
Basically the jail, yeah. So 4 out of 10.
Oh, then you got the
10 people in this town. 10.
There's a fire truck.
10.
There's a fire truck guy too.
Okay, so 50% of this town is government bureaucracy, or at least on the government payroll or whatever. Kind of hilarious.
Yeah, so let's get into a category. Let's do the tears jerked one because I feel like they were trying to pull on so many emotional heartstrings in this movie. It's a Pixar movie, and that's kind of what they're known for. They play this like an instrument, And I just want to say, personally, for me, I feel like they were at the jerk store and running out of tears to be jerked. I mean, they were playing on the poor town being neglected and all these businesses closing, but they were also pulling on Owen Wilson's character being mean to people, but then also the Doc Hudson character being this reluctant, very sad character who crashed out when he was a racer. And then they have the whole redemption at the end, which I got to tell you, man, it did make me well up a little bit. So I think that there was a high number of tears jerked in this. Not that it's a particularly good movie, and not that the emotional elicitations are even legitimate, because they want you to feel bad for these Luddites in this small town who are not willing to take initiative and see the writing on the wall, like we were saying before. And the whole message seems to be this buy local kind of idea for the nostalgic element. But if you do that, what you're doing is you're buying a lower cost of living because you're paying a higher price for these goods and services, right? So it's really kind of a backwards message.
Yeah, and I know a lot of people that do like to support local stuff, and that's, I mean, perfectly fine. You have your preferences, and you service those preferences because that's what you want to see in the world. You want to have the convenience of having these little local shops, and you want to have the different character.
You pay the price for that.
Yeah, but you pay a price. You pay a premium price for it, for sure. But to say that, yeah, that these places are being neglected and then that's something to be sad about, well, I'm sorry. You're falling on deaf ears here, sir. I know too much about economics, and I know about the unseen. And the fact that those things are being left behind means that people are preferring other things. They find other things more valuable. So, yeah, you're not... I shed 0 tears when it was, trying to play the violin for the little town. The only time that I did kind of well up was at the very, very end when McQueen makes the big switch and he, sees all his friends and, he makes those human connections because he does start out as a jerk with 0 friends. At one point in the very beginning, his agent who doesn't care about him at all or whatever, it's just a, professional relationship, gives him 20 tickets to give away. And he can't think of a single friend that he would give his tickets to. So he's like this, he's a successful guy, but he's all about being a professional racer. And he hasn't, taken the time to, establish any kind of, human connections. He doesn't even like his sponsors, who are kind of these yokel-y people. And then, he turns out to really end up enjoying the relationships with these yokel-y people. And I guess the message of that movie is, there is value in those relationships. Of course there is. But, I guess this is a kid's movie, so I guess, you can find friends in unexpected places. I guess that's a good message for a child. But please don't take it to heart that you got to support, places that are covered in rust and falling apart and whatever. They're falling apart. I mean, if you find value in, rusty things and fixing them up or seeing beauty and that kind of thing, great. But don't feel like it's any kind of huge tragedy that people prefer a better service or a better thing. They've found more value in other things. That's people following their own preference. So, yeah, I don't know about tears jerked. I'd say like a 2 or a 3.
Really, that low?
And that's just for the end scene.
Yeah,
the rest of it was nothing.
I'm like an 8, man, and that's weird because you're usually the more emotional of the two of us. But during the last race, when his friends show up, I mean that's kind of cool. But then when Doc Hudson shows up and he's like in his racing colors, I'm like, oh yeah, that's pretty awesome. And then when the King crashes on the final lap, and then McQueen goes back to he forgoes winning the race, and he goes back to get the King and pushes him across the end. I mean, that's some tear-jerking material right there.
I completely agree with you. That's the one scene where I welled up, for sure. But, I guess maybe I'm judging this movie a little bit differently than you are. I mean, it takes more than one good emotional scene for me to call it, a positive in numbers of tears jerked.
Now, I do want to ask you.
Go ahead.
Earlier, during the first race that ends up in a tie because he's a jackass and blows his tires, but there's a 3-way tie. The Costas and Darrell Waltrip, I think that's the guy's name, their calling of the race, that was like super good. I mean, it elicited emotion in me, even though it's like this totally staged like cartoon movie. But Costas just has that way of conveying a sporting event to where it just really gets you going, He's like a master at that stuff.
I thought it was really good. I mean, the version I watched was pitched down a little bit, so his voice is a little bit off. But of course, it was Costas. I didn't recognize the other guy. I assumed the other guy was a real like NASCAR kind of commentator dude. And I thought it was weird that Costas was there. because, I don't think he normally does NASCAR. But I agree with you. He is a master and is really good at getting the attention and interest and, emotional involvement in the audience.
All right. So what's another category that we do other than tears jerks? So you're like a 2 and I'm like an 8.
Well, what other scenes were emotional for you if you're giving it an 8? Can't be just that one last scene.
Well, it's the initial, Costas stuff that gets you fired up. The 3-way race. It's like super exciting.
You were in tears.
Not in tears, but
scene.
I did feel that excitement, right? Even though I've seen the movie before. And then the whole final race. Though I will say that the making you feel bad about the poor economics of the town and the love story between the two leads there, the Carrera and Lightning McQueen, I didn't really feel too much on that regard.
Yeah, I liked it. I liked it, but it didn't really tug my heartstrings.
Yeah, so you might be dragging me down just a little bit here. Maybe 8's a little high.
You can like it however much you want, but Giuseppe stocked snow tires.
Yeah, not
the desert.
Not the best entrepreneur there.
In a dead town with an employee, and he's got snow tires. Okay. Econ 101, anyone? Business school? Just a little bit? I don't know. Just a thought.
No, that's a good thought, and I'll give them credit for, trying to play the emotional heartstrings, however misguided their economics. But
fair enough. One thing that bugged me though just a little bit in the last scene where the Hudson Hornet is the crew chief, and he's got this giant comical set of like a headset on, and he's talking to Lightning McQueen. And I get it. I know why he's got this giant comical headset on, because he's the crew chief, and that's what they wear in NASCAR. But he's talking to Lightning McQueen. Lightning McQueen doesn't have a giant comical headset, and he can hear him just fine and talk back to him. So clearly this giant headset is not necessary. So I like to think of it as him just wearing this giant prop just for funsies. It makes the scene way better for me.
Oh, that didn't bother me too much. They're trying to make it as, have the little cues in there to make it make sense. But even in, real racing, they have the speaker in their headset inside their helmet, and there's really no helmet on these cars.
Right, which is why it was ridiculous.
Yeah. Oh, I wanted to ask you about the eye placement. Does it bother you at all? I read that there was some controversy because most people, I guess at the time, thought that the eyes should be the headlights, because that's generally how things go in this very leftist-leaning Gawker media site. Jalopnik apparently had a big issue with this and wrote an article about it, saying how dumb it was that the eyes were in the windshield.
Well, that's ridiculous. Everything Gawker publishes is really dumb, but not to paint with too broad a brush there, but prove me wrong. Come at me, bro. Show me one thing on Gawker that's not really stupid. And they pump out tons of content. But anyway, there's a history with older Disney movies, or the Brave Toaster and those kind of things, where the headlights are the eyeballs for cars. But if you are animating a character, your number one job, is to create an emotional connection to the audience. And the best way to do that is with a highly expressive character. And the best way to do that with cars is to use a very large area to have the eyeballs, because the eyeballs are probably the most expressive thing you can do. especially with, you're dealing with inanimate objects that don't have, can't crinkle their foreheads and that kind of stuff. I mean, they can use their mouths, and the mouths are kind of ridiculous in this movie, but I give it all a pass because, you want to create an emotional bond with the characters, and you need to be able to identify and see them expressing emotion. And what better way to do that than to use as much area as possible?
Yeah, I would agree with that. And it almost reminded me of like Japanese animation, like anime style. They always have the really large eyes, or at least that's like my perception of it.
Yeah. There's a reason why Japanese anime vastly over-exaggerates their eyeballs. And it's kind of funny. It's led to the perception that large eyes are very attractive in Japan. So they get, cosmetic surgery to widen the eyeballs. But, it's all good.
Yeah, but it is because of the expressiveness in the animation, right? They're trying to convey a story. And so now it's like seeped into the culture. Because, I mean, this is going to sound, totally awkward, but generally speaking, Asians have like more slanted eye, right? Like a narrower eye or more horizontal. And so now...
How dare you point out actual physical things that exist?
I know, and I'm trying to be very careful in describing it. But because of the animators wanting to expressively tell a story, they made the eyes bigger. And so now that's causing people in the population to think that that's like a desirable thing, which is kind of interesting. I don't know.
Yeah. It's a life imitating art. But that's always been the case with animation. I mean, if you go back all the way back to, Mickey Mouse and Bugs Bunny, and those characters will always had giant eyeballs because you wanted to, express emotion and connect with the audience.
Yeah. Now, maybe you understand if there's a distinction between them, but why is it that, Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck and all of them did have large eyes, Bugs Bunny, but why does it stand out, at least to me, that Japanese anime is like somehow different, like they're bigger or more expressive?
Well, yeah, they're using human faces where, I don't know, it's a very cultural thing with them. I don't know. I can't really explain it other than it's always been that way. I think even if you go back to the old Japanese woodblock prints, it's not as exaggerated, but I don't know. If you get into anime, there are all kinds of different like tropes with ways to express different emotions and feelings, and it's always super exaggerated. Like when someone's angry, they'll show them, with like a super red face and like steam coming off their foreheads, and it's just dialed up to 11, Spinal Tap style. It's just to quickly, and expressively show this emotion. It's just that there's no misunderstanding with it, I guess you could say, because artists aren't always perfect. It takes a super master, to be able to express perfect human emotion with just a 2D drawing, in one panel, and have it be perfectly understood by the reader. I mean, that's just some next level shit. So it would make sense to me that the average anime artist, who is still super talented, but maybe isn't the most perfect thing, would develop a quick, easy kind of a method of expressing an emotion that doesn't require you to be the most perfect artist of all time.
Yeah, it makes sense. Yeah, like water flows downhill. Why not use something that's an easy, quick way to do it if it works?
Yeah. And plus, you got to draw so much. I mean, those guys are just chained to their desks, drawing constantly. It's they got to pump out a lot of content, man. The Japanese manga market and anime market is massive and employs tons of people. In fact, there are Gawker articles, of course, opining about the low rate of pay among manga artists and anime artists. It's actually, slightly above like minimum wage, and they, complain about the working conditions and the long hours. And I'm like, well, clearly, I mean, the wages are low because there's a ton of supply of labor, and they're willing to work in those conditions. I don't know what to tell you, but they think that unionizing and blah blah blah, fighting and using violence to demand and get laws passed for better conditions and higher pay is the way to go.
Yeah, more of the seen and unseen. They certainly don't have a problem with violence, whether they comprehend that that's what it is or not. Speaking of, I want to take this back to cars, shifting gears on you. Ha ha.
Ha ha ha.
Ha ha. So we had mentioned that the highway got built and it allowed a lot of people to just bypass this town, and the town suffered as a result. But, highways, at least in this country in present day, are handled by the government. And so I'm wondering if you give them a bit of a pass as if they are victims of poor decision-making by the government because they chose to move the road, far enough out of the way or whatever, because, they're not making decisions based on a market, right? They're making bureaucratic decisions on, lowest cost or quickest whatever, without taking a lot of the human element into it or really any market-based mechanisms. And the whole highway system, as developed by Eisenhower and then, predecessors that were sort of the nascent beginnings of this, and Route 66 was part of the initial drive to have a, I'm using all sorts of puns, man, Jesus, crazy, to get a cross-country route, because it went from Chicago down to Los Angeles, or down to Santa Monica. But I'm just curious if you see that as a potential miscue on government, thus distorting what happens to these people or these cars in this town. Because there's a kid's book called the Tuttle Twins series, and one of theirs is The Road to Serfdom, which is about the government building a new road that causes this popular beach to be bypassed, and now this other beach is getting all the business. And it's just about how the distortions of these arbitrary decisions made by government affects the, the unintended consequences upon people that are impacted by these things. So, any comments on that?
Oh, I've got comments, Daniel. It's well known among libertarians and ANCAPs and whatevers that, and if you really understand government, government absolutely picks winners and losers. Government kind of bends to the will of the loudest or the most generous donors. Oftentimes, corporations will write their own legislation, and they'll have a couple senators in their pocket who push it through, and then they pass it without even reading it. You know the story. So I do have a ton of sympathy for the entrepreneur who gets crushed and squashed by these arbitrary government decisions. Well, not necessarily arbitrary, but, bought and paid for government decisions most of the time. Or even when they do have good intentions, quote, good intentions. We did a movie with Walter Block. What is the name of that movie? It's all about
Poverty Inc.
Poverty Inc. Right. It was all about the plight of the entrepreneur in the face of what is it? With like charity and like not GMOs. What's NGOs? Sorry, NGOs and that sort of thing. And it's a very nuanced movie, and it got some things right, and it got a lot of things wrong. But one thing that did kind of tug on my heartstrings in that movie is the plight of the entrepreneur, and how difficult it is for an entrepreneur to even turn a profit in today's day and age with all the regulations, and just how hard it is even to succeed, even without, just with competition, and that's the way it should be. But the vast majority of businesses that start fail, and that's the market choosing, what it desires the most, finds the most value in. But it can, you could have a great idea, and you can have the best business model in the world, and you could just get crushed through no fault of your own. And it does breed a better entrepreneur. You need to be more aware, hyper aware of all the possible pitfalls and dangers and all the horrific things that can happen to you as a business owner. And one of the biggest ones, if not the biggest one, of course, is government. I mean, I would love it if it was, get rid of government and just have massive open competition. And at least then you would, your business would fail and go, well, I got outcompeted. Someone just did it better than me. At least then it would be fair in that sense, as opposed to what you're describing with these arbitrary or bought and paid for, crony government decisions where you just get crushed, even though you had a great idea. Now, I'm going to argue with you about whether or not these people had a really great idea. I mean, snow tires in the desert. But maybe at one point, when they first bought in, they had a thriving, booming business. But still, I mean, I'm not going to shed any tears for these guys after 2 years or whatever the timeline is. He said in years, so it's been a while that they haven't packed up and moved out, because it is only like I said, the improbable series of events that they befriended this world-famous racer car who then decides to put his headquarters in this little town that revitalizes it. It would be fun. I don't know. I'm sure there's sequels to these movies, right? There's Cars 2 and 3. I don't know if they all take place in Radiator Springs or, whatever, if it becomes a thriving, bustling metropolis, or they just move on to a new town. I don't know what the storylines are in those movies.
Funny you ask, because I happen to know.
Do you? Okay, well, I'd be interested to see, because I would assume, I would imagine that, geography is going to win out. I mean, you can have an attraction that will draw people to your town, like, the one thing that springs to mind would be like, what's the name of that little town where the alien...
Oh, Roswell? Yeah.
So I can imagine that Roswell is just some podunk little town, but people come from all over just for that one fact that supposedly a UFO landed there one time. So, if there's nothing really drawing people out to this Radiator Springs, I can imagine it just dying in, a couple more years or whatever, once the hype dies down from his headquarters being there or whatever. But why don't you tell me what happens in the succeeding Cars movies?
All right, since we won't do these as episodes, number 2 follows Lightning McQueen going on a Grand Prix around the world race, and then Mater is along for the ride, and he's of course embarrassing Lightning all along the way at every turn, and he is believed to be an undercover spy by these British MI6 types, and they think that he just has this brilliant cover of playing this dumb, rusty, American hick. But then he, accidentally does these things that get him out of danger or thwart the enemy, etc. So that's number 2. It's heavy on the Mater, and it's not that great. Number 3 is back to Lightning McQueen, and he's been very successful for many years. He's been winning a lot of Piston Cups, and he's made friends that are his racing competitors, but he's also buddy-buddy with them. So he's changed a lot from being in Cars 1. But he's also getting a little long in the tooth, and there's these new upstart competitors that are more scientifically, measured and designed, so they take more advantage of their horsepower and their aerodynamics and their training methods and things like that. And Lightning's not able to compete with them very well. Like he starts losing to them, and it becomes a transition story where he is now going to refocus on his training to be able to hang with these guys because he thinks he still has some gas left in the tank. Ha ha ha. And he doesn't want to go out
Your
on...
fifth car pun so far. Just keeping track. This is like a drinking game. I'd be pretty lit up by now. But go ahead.
I know, right? And I didn't even write these things down. So he wants to go out on his own terms. He wants to not quit because he's losing. He wants to win and then walk away. So he goes through this training with this coach who is this young female yellow car who is very much into the technology and the training methods and all of these things. She knows a lot about that kind of stuff, but not a lot about, say, the spirit of racing or the tacit experience and the the wily veteran type stuff that he has amassed through actually doing the races. And so he ends up being frustrated by her training methods and trying to show her, no, here's what you would actually do in this kind of a corner, or here's how you would actually do this on this kind of track. And they end up doing the final race, and he starts the race, but then has her finish the race for him with his number, and she ends up winning through a combination of him teaching her the spirit of racing and her having the technology, and he then takes the role of the Doc Hudson character and becomes her crew chief. So it's him passing the torch.
Sounds like a decent set of trilogy, but they never go back to Radiator Springs, or is it never mentioned again?
It's mentioned, just in passing. There's not a whole lot of, in Radiator Springs, unlike Cars 1, where, 90% of the story's in the town.
Well, that's unfortunate. I mean, I wouldn't expect an economic kind of true thing to happen, so I could see them not going back to Radiator Springs and showing it be like a bustling metropolis or a dead town or anything like that. So,
I mean, that kind of thing happened with Las Vegas, right? It was just a patch of desert, and you let a little illicit activity go on,
a little bit of freedom.
A little bit of freedom, and all of a sudden you get this bustling metropolis, tourist destination.
Yeah.
And mafioso. Maybe that was why Guido or Giuseppe Giuseppe had his little shop. It was cover for the mob there.
Yeah, that's right.
But anyway, speaking of the mob, I just want to throw one other thing out at you, and it is the interstate highway system. Overall, the initial cost estimate was to be $25 billion over 12 years. And it ended up costing $114 billion in the same adjusted inflation dollars, and taking 35 years. So nothing like government to take about 5 times the cost and 2.5 times the timing that they think they're going to take.
Yeah, I mean, any government program that fails, they just we didn't have enough money. Throw more money at it. That's always it's failing forward. I mean, if you were in the private sector, you just would have gone out of business, or been taken over by somebody who could have done it efficiently, but the government.
Yeah, who will build the roads indeed. And you had brought up Walter Block earlier. He was our guest on our episode on Poverty Inc., and people can find that. We'll post that down below. But he also is a guy who writes a lot on the privatization of roads, and he's a great resource on that. So I highly recommend that guy and his writings when it comes to answer the question of who will build the roads.
Yeah, baby. So we have to wrap this baby up?
Yeah, we are about ready to do the final summary and review, so go for it, Robert.
Okay, so as usual with my kids' movie reviews, I mean, I'll say I would recommend this to show your kids. I'm not going to call you a terrible parent if you watch this, unlike with Lion King. You can You can watch this one. There's not nearly as much horrific propaganda or, economic fallacies. There's a bunch of series of crazy events, but for the most part, it's a fun movie. There's likable characters. The main character has an arc. It's got a good message to the movie. So it's not like I said, with the economic issues and the tugging on the heartstrings and that bit, it didn't hit me. But overall, for a kids movie, I would say this is like a solid 8. I don't know. I don't have kids of my own, so I can't say if this is like their favorite movie or anything like that. But I could see this being as popular as it became. I remember walking through, like a Walmart or a Fred Meyer or whatever, and just seeing all kinds of Cars merchandise all over the place. So I knew kids were, buying it up, and it's really popular. And I can see why. It's, Pixar. This is back in the kind of the golden age of Pixar, when they were just kind of killing it with, Lasseter at the helm, doing all the big movies, having a large hand in all those movies, like him and Bird. So yeah, this is a strong movie. As an adult movie, it's less good. I like the end scene a lot, but it is all built up from the rest of the movie. I mean, there's a fair amount of telegraphing what's going to happen in the story. As a seasoned movie watcher, but I can't really complain too much about it. This is primo Pixar. Not the best Pixar movie. Don't get me wrong. It's not the best, but good. It's a solid Pixar movie in their kind of heyday time.
All right. Well, thank you for that. And I'm very surprised at such a high rating, especially with so few tears jerked. Like I said, the jerk store called and they were all out of tears, and I had an 8 on the tears jerked. I found that there was a whole lot of story going on in here, and the characters do change a fair amount, and I really enjoyed that. I do like watching this one with the kids, and I do get fired up. Owen Wilson is a great, this was his peak, I think. He was just in Wedding Crashers right before this, and then this came out. He had been in Zoolander. So this is like Owen Wilson at his prime, the peak of his powers. And very enjoyable characters, a whole lot of merchandise as a result. And I find that, being the Route 66 thing, I'm going to go with an overall rating of 6.6. And, just to throw, not even a pun, but, just make it like the road. So 6.6 for me. And I also wanted to mention that John Ratzenberger, he's been in all of the Pixar movies, at least up to this point in 2006. He was at least some character all the way from Toy Story into Cars. And at the end of Cars, in the credits, they actually have versions of Toy Story, Monsters, Inc., and something else.
Bug's Life.
Bug's Life. Played as Cars, and the Ratzenberger character in Cars is watching, and he goes, "What is this? They're just using the same guy in all of these movies. What kind of cut-rate production is this?" And that totally reminded me of that sign for some cut-rate auto parts that we found behind my house one year, like when we were kids. And I always thought, that's the worst name for your product, right? Like cut-rate auto parts, like piece of shit auto parts,
Well, the best part about it is that the acronym is CRAP, and it was Brad's CRAP. It was Brad's Cut Rate Auto Parts, and I had that sign on my not peachy, but my binder in school for at least 4 years, maybe more than that. Probably through college, probably had that on there until that thing finally fell off and died. But yeah, that thing's classic, man.
Yeah,
crap auto parts. I might still have it. Might still be somewhere. It might still be in my possession somewhere. I don't know where it is, but yeah, it's a good sign.
Yeah, super good sign and super good night from me. So I'm going to say last night, or good night from last night. This will be found at lastnighters.com/9, and we'll play a little outro music after Robert says good night.
It's been an honor and a white male privilege talking to you good people, you good, beautiful, handsome, sexy people tonight. I'm glad I did the show. Glad you listened to it. You guys have a good night.